Yes.
All right, so I'm Amanda, and both Selena and I are going to be talking about and presenting on the Child Advocates of Fort Bend. Um, so to start off, what is the center and its mission? The mission of the Children's Advocacy Center of Fort Bend is to lessen the emotional trauma to child victims by coordinating the multidisciplinary investigation, assessment, prosecution, and treatment of sexual and serious physical abuse. The CAC in Fort Bend is one of many in the state of Texas. I think almost every county has a CAC. But it's a private nonprofit agency that works with Child Protective Services, law enforcement, and the district attorney's office to provide professional services to children and their families. And so what does this mean? And what does that look like? So the center brings together all the professionals that are involved in a child's case to reduce the trauma to children going through the child abuse system. And like I mentioned earlier, that could be CPS, law enforcement, the DA's office, it could be medical examiners, mental health professionals, pretty much everyone who is involved in the case. And that's done by joint investigation coordination. And so what that means is that we work as a multidisciplinary team. Maybe a couple of times out of the month, all the partners and all the people that are involved come together. We review cases, we talk about what the status of the case is, what if there's any updates. But it's really just a time for everyone to get together, make sure they're on the same page, that we're all having the communication that we need to have so that we can make sure that this child receives pretty much the justice that they deserve. The agency also conducts recorded forensic interviews. The forensic interviews are very important because it allows a child, it gives them the space to be able to tell their story and to really talk about what's happened to them. The interviews are recorded because when a child comes out with an allegation of abuse, and because they're having to go through so many different systems, a lot of the time what happens is that they're having to tell their story over and over and over again. And that's very overwhelming. It can be really traumatizing and re-traumatizing for them to have to do that. So when an allegation is made, the first thing is that an interview is scheduled at our agency, it's recorded, and then that recording is then given to the partners on the case. The Advocates of Fort Bend, we also do family advocacy and victim support. There's trauma-focused therapy, medical evaluations. So when a child has been sexually abused or there's serious physical abuse, a lot of the time they're referred to go get medical evaluations, and whatever information is obtained from there is also used for the investigations. So when we're talking about the different services that are provided at the CAC, like I mentioned earlier, forensic interviewing, all the forensic interviews are specifically trained to interview children in a way that's neutral and non-leading. There's a very specific way about doing it, and so it's very structured. There's also family advocacy. So the family advocates at the CAC also do a little bit of case management. And so what their job is to first assess what is it that the family is needing in that moment, and really connecting them to different resources in the community to make sure that they get what they need. The family advocates also kind of support the family through the process. So they're the first people that meet with the families when they come into our agency, and they just provide support. They'll give them an explanation of what the agency does, what the process is going to look like moving forward, because a lot of families that come in have no knowledge about what the process looks like when a child has made an allegation. So they'll walk them through that, they'll guide them through that, and they'll check in with them frequently. They also do a lot of crisis intervention. And as you can imagine, if you're a parent who's finding out for the first time that your child has been abused, it's kind of like you're in a crisis, right? So they're trying to still wrap their heads around it. They're trying to process it themselves, trying to figure out what to do. And so the family advocate provides that support to them when they come into our agency. And some of the kids also receive crisis intervention because as they're telling their story and they're trying to talk about what's happened, that could be very overwhelming. And so crisis intervention is also provided to them if it's necessary. The CAC also offers free on-site therapy. We also do criminal court advocacy. This is another unique role. The criminal court advocate is responsible for kind of helping and supporting the family as they're going through the court process, and even going to trial if the case does get to go to trial. So the court advocate would kind of do a lot of court orientation. They would kind of say, hey, this is what you can expect. This is what you can say, what not to say. This is how you present yourselves. It really just gets them used to the court process altogether. When a child is having to go to trial, that's a very intimidating and very stressful thing to do. And so they just support them in that process. All the services are offered in English and in Spanish, and the agency as a whole is a neutral, child-friendly facility. And I use a lot of color in the presentation because this is what it looks like when you walk into the agency. It's very colorful and bright. So these are the numbers. Selena?
I apologize. I forgot I was on mute. But yes, so I'll talk about the numbers. And there are, thank you, Amanda, 68,018 children that receive critical services from the CAC in Texas from the year 2021. 65% of those children were female and 35% of those children were male. Ages 0 to 5 is at about 20% served, and 45% for ages 6 to 12, and 35% from ages 13 to 17, and less than 1% for ages 18 and up, obviously, since the CAC renders services to children. Anything really from 17 to 18 is considered an adult case. The child at 17 has the legal right to say if they want to move forward or not with services. 67% of the children that the CAC serves is sexual abuse cases. 17% are physical abuse cases. 6% are child witness to crime, and another 6% with neglect. 2% deals with sexual and physical abuse, and 1% deals with fatality, and 1% is other cases.
Oh, I don't know what happened, but for some reason I can't move.
Let me see if I can open it online, maybe.
Let me see if it'll let me. Oh, there it goes.
Okay, thank you. So 1 out of 10 children will experience sexual abuse before their 18th birthday. 98% of the child victims know their perpetrator. 26% of those are from a non-relative. 24% of those are from a biological parent. 20% are from another relative. 17% is from a step parent or a parent's paramour. And 8% are from a sibling or step sibling. 2% of these cases are from strangers. So children who usually are sexually abused are at a significantly higher risk for mental and physical health issues, such as, but not limited to, PTSD, anxiety, heart problems, stroke, depression, and a lot more.
It keeps doing that again. I don't know why. Okay. Oh, sorry. I don't know what's going on with the. Okay. Sorry.
So there are 4 stages of emotions that children who've been sexually abused usually go through. Shame and guilt. The child usually feels guilty for the offense, even though they're really not at fault. Another emotion is blame and anger. They blame themselves. And then grieving and mourning, and fear and anxiety. So these are the types of grief and loss and that children who've been sexually abused usually experience. They usually experience a loss of innocence in their childhood, a loss of feeling safe, usually a loss of their families and or family systems. They grieve over distrust of others. They grieve over a loss of time, and that could be from school, family, friends, and other relationships. Um, Grief over the life that they envision for themselves, and grief over the person that harmed them. Like we mentioned earlier, most of the cases, children know their offender, and grief over what could have been.
Yep.
Some of the challenges with grief or that children experience are that there are so many conflicting emotions that the children usually don't understand. Um, they feel ashamed for grieving the person that harmed them. They think something is wrong with them for missing the person who hurt them. They also feel a great sense of responsibility for for the offender and for the consequences of disclosure. An example of that would be like if the child offender was the father or mom's paramour and that the father has to leave the home, if the child has other siblings, or feel like the family misses the dad, or that it's their fault that the dad is not there, they feel like, kind of bad for that, because they feel like it's their fault that, that had to happen. Um, they also feel as if the abuse was their fault and feel ashamed for not speaking up sooner or feeling ashamed for speaking up at all. They may feel the blame to not stop the abuse and shame for being a victim, and also feel a sense of unsupportive parents or family and friends or professionals that may not make them feel like those are safe space when they reveal that information. And they also experience social stigmatization, um, such as like bullying or others making them feel as though it's their fault for the offense, and just really experience a lack of knowledge across the board when they usually experience this. So what does this look like for children who've been sexually abused? They usually experience a change of emotional behavior and an increase in externalized behaviors. So that could look like outbursts, defiance, isolation, um, not having a sense of boundaries, self-harming behavior, suicidal ideations or risks. They also have regress behavior, which is like start to behave in less mature or younger age ways. They have changes in their eating or sleeping oftentimes, and performance and or attendance at school oftentimes. And they also sometimes lack a sense of personal care and hygiene. They also usually, well, not everyone, but sometimes children who have experienced this also have risk taking behavior and inappropriate sexual behaviors.
Okay, so when we're looking at the treatment interventions that we found in our literature, but also at the CAC and what's provided there, the most common interventions that we see there are trauma-focused CBT therapy and EMDR. The CAC also holds support groups. At the moment, they're not, just because of COVID, so they're trying to bring that back. And some of the support groups that are offered are psychoeducational. So we have clients that are on a wait list for, as far as like groups go. They do have psychoeducational groups. And in those groups, they talk a little bit about what are common trauma reactions. They do a lot of educating on just trauma itself, you know, grooming behaviors, things like that. And they usually find a lot of reassurance in those, because it kind of lets them know that what it is that they're experiencing is very normal. And then other support groups that do a lot of work, as you know, in the with the sexual abuse. What is most recommended is that the clinician must be trauma trained, just because, like Selena mentioned earlier, there's a lot of different conflicting emotions that the child goes through, but also things that, you know, family members don't understand. And so if a clinician is trauma trained, this really kind of helps them out. In all the interventions, it's always best to take a person-centered approach, and creating a safe space and build trust. Like Selena mentioned, trust is a big thing. So when someone has been violated and abused, it's really hard for them to trust others. And so we make it a point to create a safe space and to build trust so that we can start doing the work that we need to do. It's so important to meet the client where they're at when they first come in and not rush the process of trying to work through the trauma. And also don't make any assumptions. So, you know, don't make assumptions about what we think the client is feeling or where we think that they're at. It's so important to get from them directly what it is that they're experiencing and what they're feeling. Focusing on their strengths is another one. Not only on the strengths for themselves, but also the strengths within their family systems, but also looking at the strengths and looking at the roles that all the people in the systems that are involved also play. Companionship is another one. Like Morten mentioned in his book, this is very similar. You know, we're meeting the clients where they're at and we're kind of guiding them through the process. And a lot of the work that's done in the TFCBT is really focusing on addressing and restructuring a lot of those cognitive distortions. So there is a lot of shame and guilt that's involved with trauma, and even with the loss, right? If a child feels responsible for other people's griefs in their family. So there's a lot of feelings of worthlessness, feeling like they're to blame. And those are different cognitive distortions that we have to work through them. The most important one is getting them to understand that they had no fault in what happened to them. If a child has also been sexually abused, there's a lot of confusion about what nurturance is, what love is, and what abuse is, right? So if a child has been abused by a parent or another family member, they kind of learn, well, this is how they showed me love. This is what I think nurturance is, or what love is, because this is what I was showed, and this is what happened to me. And so it's really kind of helping them differentiate between those things and kind of working through that with them. So it's a lot of work with cognitive distortions. And so those are the treatment interventions that we have. And so for the conclusion and the implications, when we're looking closely at the intersection of grief, loss, and trauma, there are a lot of factors that can complicate the grieving process of so many different types of losses. You know, such complications and losses can lead to complicated grief and or significant disruptions in the child's overall functioning. Advocacy centers such as the CAC are available to help children and their families in their healing and fight for justice. We see that there's still a lot of stigmas and not a lot of providers that are trauma trained that could really do the work that's needed for this kind of population. And so those are also current barriers for this group of kids. And I think this is all we have, and then these are our references. So that's it.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? I mean, I wrote here about the description of the statistics there, and it's just so upsetting, and I know that the work that they do is amazing and hard.
Yeah, one of the other things that I forgot to add was, like you mentioned, the statistics. 98% of the offenders are someone that are very close to the child. And so a lot of the time we warn people about stranger danger and not staying away from dangers, but a lot of the time it's people that are very close to that child. And so part of the grieving process and what makes it complicated is also the attachments that they have to these people that hurt them. So that was something I forgot to mention, but that also has a big part of it too.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a question.
Mhm.
So what happens if the perpetrator, I know you mentioned that sometimes it's the sibling or another family member that lives with, specifically, I'm speaking about like if it's a child. So like a nephew, cousin, or brother, whomever that lives in that home. How does that work? Like, because
Mhm.
if you're the parent of both children, usually when CPS gets involved, you have to be willing to be protective. So let's say if dad did something, you have to be willing to say dad can't come here, can't have any, what's the right word? Can't have any type of engagement with the child. But if the child that's doing the abuse is another child that's older, how does that work out?
Well, I mean, from what I've seen, I haven't had too many cases like that, but from what I've seen is charges can be pressed and obviously they can't be in the same house. But as far as like the long term, I haven't really seen what that looks like. But I imagine that there is some sort of consequence that happens to that perpetrator if it's a sibling. I know a lot of the time they do recommend for that child to also get services for themselves. Another statistic that I didn't include in the presentation is that a lot of the time when a perpetrator is like a minor and they receive the appropriate treatment, I want to say I think the number is about 90% of those adolescents, when they reach adulthood, they don't end up reoffending. So I think a lot of it has to do with just educating the child, because we see that a lot of the kids don't know what appropriate boundaries and what's okay and what's not okay. So I know that the CAC advocates for a lot of education for kids. But what it actually looks like, I mean, it's kind of hard to tell because every case is different and I haven't gone that far to see that yet.
So that was a good question. And I work a lot with the CAC I work for CPS, so I have a lot of rapport with the CAC. I have been exposed to a case like that before. It wasn't a case of mine, so I don't know exactly what happened in full detail with that case, but I know that obviously with CPS being involved, the child was removed from the home and couldn't be placed back into the home, like Amanda mentioned, because they can't be in the same home of the offender. But it did put the mom, and like Amanda mentioned earlier, it's like sometimes these parents are just finding out about these things in the moment. And so when they find out that their child has offended one of their other children, it does put them in a sense of shock and make them feel like, well, I don't even know what to do with the other child. Like, how can I be protective over my children? So I do remember, like I said, being exposed to that, and the mom did exactly feel that way, and she had no idea what to do. And I think they were making plans to put the other child, the child who offended, into another home, like another relative of hers, just so that to make efforts to try to reunify the child with her without the offender being there, if that makes sense. But usually with CPS being involved, there has to be some form of safety plan too in place, especially with them being siblings. So that's actually a really good question. And I don't think either one of us know the full answer to that question,
Yeah.
but that was a really good question.
Any other questions?
I have a question, even though this is my presentation, but Amanda, if the other child is offending, do you all render services to help the child who's offended, or just the child who's the victim?
Typically, no, because the CAC does not provide services to offenders. If a person has been identified as a perpetrator, they can't even come into the building at all. So more than likely, they would have to be referred out for someone who specializes in that kind of thing.
Identified as a perpetrator, as in the child makes the outcry, or it has to be.
Yeah, if the child makes an outcry and identifies who the perpetrator was.
Okay.
Mhm.